Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Jack Attridge, and I run a company called Flavorworks. There you go, slides. So I've been in the games industry for about 9 years. I kind of went through like a bit of a weird way to get here. I thought I'd give you a little bit of background, but first it might be useful to know what's the makeup of the room. Are we like mostly journalists or developers or students? Okay, so a bit of a mix of everything. Okay, so this is kind of a general talk about how I came to found Flavorworks and the principles that we've built that on. So my background has been first in sound design for the film industry, and then going from sound design into game design later on, across a variety of titles, some successful, some less so. And then following that career, I ended up studying Flavorworks. But before that, this is a little bit of a weird video to play. I ended up, back in like 2007, I was going to study video games in a sort of degree sense, but I ended up actually studying film. But I spent most of my time on that film course just kind of wishing that I was in the games industry, and I was very much like this one person on that course who's really thinking about film. And this is actually a film I made in my first year about how I wish that I was working in video games rather than film, and it's super cringe, so I'm not going to show any more of it. But my first job straight out of university was at EA Brightlight, working on the Harry Potter franchise, and this is kind of where I met my first lesson, which was I always assumed from kind of the outside, like, why is it that there's so many bad games out there? And it wasn't until I was on this project that I realized that sometimes developers are dealing with very weird constraints, such as you have to ship your game the same day that the movie comes out, but you only have 1 year to do it because you were busy last year making the game for the past movie. But typically games can take 2 or 3 years to make, along with new technology that you hadn't really tested, and also all the kind of restrictions that comes with getting approvals to do anything innovative with an existing franchise in case you step on the toes of that IP. And following that, I went to Rebellion, which was a very different atmosphere to this AAA studio like EA, working on things such as Sniper Elite as a sound designer, where you're designing the sound of shooting off someone's testicles in slow motion, or Judge Dredd as an iPhone game. And so that was also quite a lot of variety. And following that, I went to a studio called Mind Candy in London. And that was very different. It was less of a games company. It was actually more of like a franchise and entertainment company where games were just one element of that. And they were interested in building this big brand. And then following that, I was really starting to get itchy because I'd always really wanted to work in game design as opposed to sound design. The sound design was kind of like my ticket into the industry. So I ended up going to work with Peter Molyneux at 22 Cans and spent a few years kind of under Peter's wing learning how he makes video games. And it was quite interesting because after a few years I realized I hadn't really built the skill set of a traditional game designer, and in the same way that when Peter started, there wasn't really such a role as a game designer. He was kind of working these things out for himself. So I kind of came out the back end of this experience feeling that I didn't feel comfortable going into like a big design team of 10 or 20 designers anymore. And the whole experience of this studio was working to somebody else's vision. And I really felt like I had my own sort of games to develop, my own voice. So I kind of went through the tough scenario of telling Peter that I wanted to leave to start a studio. He was very supportive, and we started this company, Flavorworks. And so the last 4 years or so I've been working on Flavorworks, and it starts from literally sleeping on people's floors and sofas and spending a year trying to find funding and running around this sort of investment scene, as well as building technology and prototypes and trying to build a team. In the end, we were fortunate enough to get a publisher deal with Sony for a PlayStation exclusive. And for the last couple of years, we've been trying to work out how you do something for the first time. Because when we started the studio, we were like, what's the point of existing if we're going to do another first-person shooter? If you try and do another first-person shooter, you're going up against these mammoth studios who have spent decades refining their craft, refining their tech, and also their marketing budgets are huge. So this is something Barry Mead from Fireproof used to say, actually, because he's another good friend who's, I found this industry has been very sort of supportive, especially in the Guildford game scene, from Sean Murray to Barry Mead, Mark Healy. They've all really kind of helped us along this journey. And I forget what I was going to say with that. But basically, yeah, it's been very wild trying to work out what we can do differently. The thing that Barry Mead said was, if you're making an indie game, people don't owe it to you to be an indie darling. You're basically competing with Candy Crush. You're basically competing with Call of Duty, no matter what size you're at, because the audience doesn't owe you anything. And so that was the problem for us. We were like, if we're starting a new studio, how do we compete with everybody? It's not going to be from first-person shooter. And so we started thinking about what it is to make games and why games are what they are. And a big driver of this was saying, how can we bring games to more people? And so I started from the beginning, started thinking about Unity. Like, this is the first thing a developer sees when they load up Unity, more or less, right? Like, they get a 3D cube, and then you're saying, okay, what am I going to do with this cube? There's a million things I could do with this. Most of the time, you start looking at that 3D space, and you start exploring how this cube relates to that 3D space. And so 9 times out of 10, the first thing we start doing is exploring traversal in a 3D environment. And it's very interesting, right? Because when I'm standing up here, or when we're going about our day-to-day life, we're not thinking about the obstacles that we have to deal with that day in terms of things that we need to walk around and things we need to avoid. You know, for a lot of people, walking is very second nature, or just traversing. And yet this is kind of like becomes our main conflict in video games. And so if you're starting with this as a building block every single time, it's very likely that, well, it's not surprising that as an industry, you go to the shelves in a game or something like that in a store, and these are all games about moving a protagonist around an environment. And the interesting thing is, if you think about it, when you are moving around an environment, none of the storytelling is happening. This is something that happens in between to get you to the places where the storytelling happens. So this seed is what kind of started the thinking about FlavorWorks. The second part of this, of course, is that the result of this is that typically our games are about these external conflicts, running, and jumping, and shooting. These very physical things, these things that always end up in empowerment fantasies mostly. But when you look at theater or books or movies, we're generally dealing with interpersonal relationships. But this is a very hard thing to gamify when you're running your character around jumping on people's heads, and most of the time they don't react to it. And actually, so I'm going to play you a little video, assuming the sound will work, and if it doesn't, I'll just talk over it. There is this YouTube show called Clueless Gamer with Conan O'Brien, famous American TV host. And I found this video to be really eye-opening, especially when I was starting to think about building a studio, because this is someone who hasn't grown up with games for the past 30 years of their life. When we play games, we're almost educated to play them. We kind of understand these invisible codes and conventions. Even, I remember like Charlie Brooker a decade ago, a decade before Bandersnatch, was saying, when you play Grand Theft Auto, you just have an instinct for which doors are real and which doors are painted on. But if you bought someone who'd never played a game before, they would have no idea which doors are real, which doors are painted on. These are like things we've just grown to understand. We kind of accepting the limitations of our medium. And so this is like a tiny video of Conan O'Brien kind of getting to grips with a successful game like Resident Evil. Let's see if there's sound.
Look at this. I'm gonna get really close to her and see what she does. At this point in real life, women say something. Get away from me. It's not funny, Conan. Leave me alone. I have a boyfriend.
Whoa, all right.
I want to shoot something. What's that?
What's that?
Only one way to find out.
Blocked there. Great, there's a hoarder living here. I can't get past anything. Can't get over chairs in way. Cool guy with gun blocked by small folding chairs. Okay, that zombie has died of natural causes by now.
So I found it really eye-opening because, if I was going to play that game, I don't think about my proximity to the other characters. They're just someone to help me on my way. The objective of the game is to shoot zombies. It's not to worry about the personal space with other people. But if you're coming to a game for the first time, you're just coming with your model of the real world. And so those sort of things start to jar. They start to kind of ruin our immersion. And then even as artists or environment artists, we just know we want to bring people down a certain path. So when we put a chair in a way, we just know that that's like a shortcut to create some context to the world that's going to restrict us. But of course, in real life, we can circumvent a chair very easily. And so these are just things that we take for granted And I kind of took this a little bit further. Whenever I found like an interesting narrative game I'd like to put in front of friends and family I know that don't play games. And one of these was my mother here. I was exposing her to beginning of The Last of Us, which, one of my favorite games. As most people in this room will know, it has a kind of emotional opening. And the interesting thing I found here was that no matter how good the performance was and the storytelling, she couldn't connect to it for the pure fact that it didn't look real to her. And that's a really weird thing to say, because we have things like Pixar, with beautiful animation, really incredible storytelling. But whenever you do see these kind of CGI storytelling in films, it's only really the family-friendly movie genre. It's never like these mature stories, for instance. And so, as developers, this is kind of what we're used to. We're spending millions and millions of dollars trying to render something close to a human face. And this appeals to, this audience here, of course. But in film, they point a camera at an actor, and you get all of this unrivaled nuance and emotion for free. And this is just something that, we can keep pushing those polygons, but are we ever going to be able to rival that? And then finally, there's lots of assumptions about video games and who they're for, and it kind of started in the 90s, right, where you had these supermarkets, and when it came to the toy section, they had just categories, gender categories. And when it came to Nintendo and Sega, the marketing people had to work out which aisle this was going to be in, and so they ended up siding with boys. And so all these games became targeted mostly towards guys, and now we're in 2019, and we're getting to that point where games are starting to really get a broader spectrum and appeal to more people. But it's really interesting, and this is kind of where it started, and that was always in the back of my mind. So I was thinking, how do we make games that appeal to this existing audience and also appeal to a new audience? So I started thinking about what are the things that people would kind of find a little bit off-putting about video games. The first one is the time investment. I mean, as you get older, as you get responsibilities, jobs, family, etc., you don't have much time to invest in these experiences. And there's a lot of sort of these games that take like 50, 60 hours. And don't get me wrong, I invested a nice 160 hours into Red Dead Redemption 2, even though I shouldn't have. But it's a big ask. It's a big ask, right? And as we've kind of already sort of touched upon, is that there's this education. You need to know how to dual wield 2 analog sticks. You need to know that there's these shoulder buttons up here that you can't actually see when you're there. So for a lot of people, they just wouldn't know where to start. And the word game, right, implies winning and losing. It implies high scores. It's about challenge. It always has been about challenge, particularly as a kind of relic of the arcade days. And again, most people don't go to a film or a book or a play because they want to be challenged in how they access that content. And again, as we discovered, because of the sort of legacy of video games, that subject matter can be quite limited. And again, the aesthetic can really turn people off as well. But ultimately, this can all kind of amalgamate to this idea that games are still games, and they're a toy, and they're a gimmick, and they're not culturally, artistically important. So when we started our studio, we really wanted to think about a couple of these ideas. The first was to make sure that we could make something that was bite-sized, that people could get over and complete in a couple of hours, and then they could go back to it and get more out of it if they wanted. But ultimately, we wanted to respect their time. And then we were thinking, how do we bring people into a game experience when they've never played a game before? And so one of the ideas circling was to piggyback on existing things that people know about. And so film is very much, in the cultural mainstream, and all of us are kind of subliminally encoded with this understanding of what a crossfade means, and to not get disorientated when we cut to another angle. These are things that all audiences, anyone with a TV in their room, have kind of grown up with, and they kind of understand, and it's a really nice thing to leverage. And then, again, part of our design was to focus on the characters, focus on the story and the emotions, and not to focus on the drive, like trying to not get people obsessed with trophies and achievements and secrets, and to drive them purely on their interest in the story and characters. And then, for us, again, piggybacking these existing models, such as film, we decided to go for kind of like a thriller or drama structure that you'd expect in a typical film. And on top of that, this is where we kind of came to the conclusion with everything that a live-action aesthetic would actually allow us to enable a lot of these things. And with that, the kind of aesthetic that we could go for would give it sort of a more grandiose feel. But I mean, there's a real spectrum of audience for this industry, from, core AAA games with deep controls to very simple swipey games for mobile that have been really popular. And so we've been developing this game called Erica, and we kind of have the aspiration of bridging between these two worlds, where we're making a PlayStation game that we hope that anyone who's a big fan of branching narrative games, whether it's Don't Nod or Quantic Dream or Telltale or Supermassive, we want to appeal to that audience, but we want to remove any barriers to entry for everybody else. Not because we just want it to be for everybody, but also just because we want to make all of the interface sort of fade away so you can just focus on that story. But FMV, or full motion video, these live action games, they've been going since the 80s, and they kind of haven't really evolved since the 80s. Even Bandersnatch is essentially binary choice. You load another video, you go on to the next video. So we started to say, why is it that this has always failed before? The first one for me is, when we're in a 3D world, we know that there's a lot of freedom in there, but as soon as you have a video, and then you put like UI on top of it, it feels like immediately all of that interface is outside of the world. It's flat. It doesn't feel like a part of the environment. On top of that, mostly our interactions are down to button presses. It's down to sending a command. It's like playing God. It doesn't feel like you're actually involved in the scenario. Again, being film, it's very much this rhythm of, okay, I'm going to make a choice, and then I'm going to sit back and watch 5 minutes of film, and then after 5 minutes, the game's going to remind me that there's another choice to make. And I've seen this happen where that becomes really tedious for people, because as soon as they've started watching the video, they've forgotten they were playing a game. And suddenly they lean back, right? Because film is a lean back experience, but games are very much a lean forward experience. And when you go for that amount of time without interacting, it starts to become chore and tedious, and you start to question why you're playing an interactive film in the first place. And ultimately, because of these long gaps and because of the limitations in interactivity, you do have a very limited impact on the player story. And out of this also comes this like player character dissonance, because you'll get into a story, suddenly your character already has this big lifestyle, already has this whole personality that you weren't there for, and you're kind of coming in at the very last moment. And it feels like your involvement is like token choices, and that this is a film with this gimmick to be able to change the narrative, and we really wanted to get away from that. And so in the end, you don't end up with a great film, and you don't end up with a great experience. And we wanted to end up with a great film and a great experience. So we started Flavorworks, and we tried to come up with a few pillars, like a few things we wanted to do in order to enable something memorable and meaningful. The first one was to really rethink the way we think about game design, in a lot of the ways that I've already kind of discovered here, but also in many, many macro, micro ways that you'll never see them, you'll never know they're there, but hopefully you'll feel them, or you'll be pulled out of the experience less. The second one was to make sure that we're not doing what the industry had previously done in the old days, which was you're developing a game, you build it around some USPs, and then eventually storytellers come in and they'll write something for the loading screens. And it was really interesting, because when we were looking for writers for Flavorworks and for our game Erica, we found that there were some incredible writers in this industry. And surprisingly, a lot of the time, when you really get down to it, they're writing cutscenes and they're writing dialogue during the kind of gameplay sections, but it's not actually interactive. It's actually very on rails, and it's beautiful the way they've kind of disguised this, and it allows us to be immersed in the experience. But actually, they're telling the story, and you do not have a place in that story. So it's been very hard to find that balance where you have only now a generation of writers growing up where video games are as relevant a source of influence for them as books or film. And so now we're getting to that point where there is talent out there that love video games and they love storytelling in a linear sense, and they're in a very good position to be able to bridge those two. But we had some very cool, lofty visions or aspirations for what we wanted to do with this. And when we try to do this in existing engines like Unity, Unreal, these fantastic pieces of kit that are built for creating these wonderful 3D experiences, we realized they're not targeted towards video. Why would they be? Right, so we kind of realized we would have to build the technology from the ground up ourselves. So we made this piece of tech called Touch Video. It's like a multi-platform engine. It comes with this editor called Cookbook. And what it allows us to do is write a story, a script, right into our engine, build lots of designs into it, spit out a script format that we can then take to film sets, and then we can completely change the way that we film stuff, which is our mixed media production workflow, which requires us to have in-house film producers, in-house game producers, and work out this whole new model of going through one medium and reinventing that, and then going through a second medium, having to reinvent that. One that's 40, 50 years old, one that's over 100 years old. And then on the back end, we have to be able to then edit the experience, re-edit it, find our story, drag and drop this back into our engine, and then suddenly you have this interactive video experience that works like magic. So these were kind of like our pillars for success, and this is what we invested in. So Flavorworks is actually a small studio. There's only 8 of us. And in that, there's myself, my designer Faye, my writer Connor, and then we have a few programmers, a film producer, a game producer, and together we're making this very ambitious game. And then when we're filming, you'll bring in dozens and dozens of filmmakers to help you for that moment, and then you'll scale back down again. So I'm just going to show you, for anyone who hasn't seen Netflix's Bandersnatch.
What you want for your breakfast?
This is
We'll
kind
sing
of
a
what
bit kiddie wink to me.
the industry knows now as live action video. So you have these 2 choices at the bottom of the screen. You click on them, the rest of the story plays out. In about 5 minutes, you'll get another choice. And it was very popular. It went trending worldwide. And that was very exciting for us because we really wanted to take it to that next level. But the thing that really stood out to us about this, and any other attempts to do this in the past, is that the film and games industries have always had a hard time getting to understand each other. They're all very opposing goals. And we feel that the only way to kind of make these 2 mediums work is to start from the game side and then move in to the filmmaking side from there. Unfortunately, for me, my background in film meant that this was a little bit easier than in most cases. And so going from Bandersnatch, our aspiration with Erica was to make sure that we were fixing all of these problems. So this is kind of a general scene in Erica. These are different choices you can make. The idea is that the UI immediately is spatial. It's in the world. When the camera moves, the UI moves. When you move your finger around the screen, you can select these choices. And then sometimes we'll do a camera cut, but we won't wait until the end of that clip. We'll do it immediately. Or if someone's talking, we'll wait until they finish talking, then we'll do it. We're trying to make this feel as if every step you take was always the director's cut. And there's no abruptness, nothing jarring, nothing that feels delayed. And the important thing for us was, rather than waiting 5 minutes, that the player is interacting every 15 to 20 seconds. So you're constantly responding, you're getting a response, you're getting some more context that leads you into the next part of gameplay. And also, one of the probably stupidest ideas I had that we have pulled off in the end was that we decided Erica would only speak if the player chose for her to speak. And that doesn't sound, this sounds fairly trivial, but if you then bring a screenwriter or writer into the room and you say, okay, one of the best tools that you have at your disposal, which is your protagonist being able to basically express themselves, say what they want, say where they're going, and you take that away and say, she'll only speak if the player wants her to say something. That's a tall ask, and it was very, very complicated. But the beautiful thing about this was after a while, you really feel more connected to her. You really feel like she isn't going off on her own narrative, and then you're coming in as this sort of disembodied God and making a choice for her. You feel like you're living in the same skin, or you feel like you're her conscience. You can't change what's in her heart, but you can be that voice of reason that changes what she decides to do. And actually, once we had a bug in the game where Erica spoke a bit of dialogue without a player choosing something. And suddenly, the moment she did that, it felt very weird. And that's kind of when we knew that this was worth doing. That it was just a subtle thing. No one's going to ever notice this stuff. But it's just there to make me feel like I'm not watching a film that says, where do you want this film to go? And instead, I'm involved with a character and their journey through this. We also were saying, how do we get around in this world? We kind of ended up resorting to kind of point-and-click design, but we wanted to do whatever we could to make this world feel like it wasn't a static video. So with the cursor here, for instance, you can use the gyroscope on a phone, and it allows you to pull focus between different objects in the world. And if you click on, say, the telephone in this instance, she'll just seamlessly walk over to it. So sometimes our aspiration is to use camera cuts when you make a decision, because the camera cut feels very precise. It feels like you're pressing a button. It feels like something's executing. And sometimes, if we wanted something a little bit more artistic, we will do an endless shot, like a one shot. And then if you make a choice in that shot, it will carry on flowing into the choices you make. So when we started as an iPhone and iPad game, and our aspiration was, we didn't want us to be about making choices. We wanted it to be about touching the world in a very tactile and delicious way. And so this was kind of like a little Blade Runner influence of the origami. And we made this a few years ago for a couple £100 in an Airbnb in Shaftesbury Avenue. We had like a day to make a 5-minute demo just as we were about to lose our jobs at 22 Cans. And it was important for us to say, how can we allow people to interact with this world? So we came out with some really cool ideas of how we can use video, and not just video, but multiple layers of video. So if you would tilt the phone or the iPad, you'd get this really nice parallax and stuff like that. Another example, for instance, is being able to put a key in a lock and turn that key. This is from our announcement trailer in 2017. But following this, Sony came to us and said, how can you bring this to TVs? How can you bring this to PlayStation, as they are now the publisher of Erica? And so we had the idea to use the phone as an input method. This was before, about a year or so before PlayLink would be a thing, but our idea was, whilst we were using the phone initially as your interface whilst you were watching down here, we could then use the phone with nothing on it so you could look on the TV. And so the important thing about this as well for us was going back to that idea of tutorialization and how people understand video games. Was, if you know how a phone works, and you know how a hinge works, or a Zippo works, I shouldn't have to tell you how to play my game. So we give this to playtesters every once in a while. We give them a phone, and we just bring up a Zippo in an endless black space. And every single time, they know how to use it, because it works like they expect. It has physics. It has inertia when you flick it. And then, instinctively, you can just flick it, and it will ignite. And so we find this to be a really effortless way, because we found that there's a lot of times where you have to do like a Hadouken shape on a controller or something in order to open a door handle. And I'm like, why is this harder than opening a door in real life? And so we just wanted to kind of take that equation out of the way. Another example is being able to wipe the condensation off a window and peer through to the other side. So we have these two kind of mechanics, one which is touching an object that you can manipulate, and the second is about surfaces. And it was just something that occurred to me that, in games, I rarely feel like I'm actually touching the walls of this world. I feel like my character runs into it, but I'm not having a connection with it. So we love this idea that you could wipe dust off an old book, such as here, and find kind of hundreds and hundreds of different contexts with which to use these mechanics. And I was talking, this is years ago now, but I was talking to Sam Barlow very early on, who made Her Story. He's been really supportive of us, because we were making this before Her Story was even announced. So, we had no idea each other existed. And he mentioned that back at his last company, it would take a month to build this book, to build the layers, to build the code, to build everything in order to be able to wipe dust off an old book. But with film, you can just film it and spit it out within hours. So it's a much quicker way of developing content. The important thing for us as well is video can feel a little bit prescribed, right? Like when we're in 3D worlds, we can move characters around, we feel like there's a lot of emergence, and we were trying to work out how do we make interactive video feel like it can represent a real world. And so this is an example where I can just like tilt the parallax on my phone in order to be able to peek between the door and the background of what's in that room. And if I gently open the door, then she'll just gently walk into the room. But if I'm a reckless player and I just swing the door open, we want that to creak, we want it to bang against the wall, we want people in the world to react to that, and then we want to teach the player that this world is listening to them all the time. Just because there's a video doesn't mean that it's not alive. And so, yeah, it's basically, we're trying to make a narrative where you're able to use these mechanics in various different ways. Another one we came up with was just being able to like stitch tons of 4K videos together so you could look around an environment, so you could like investigate anything on this wall and find something that's appealing to you, and just be able to effortlessly look around, and then you might find like a clue, and you might be able to click on it, and then Erica will investigate it. And so this is a look at our cookbook editor for touch video. It's very, very, very primitive. It looks kind of gross, but this is just an example of how you look. I have to blur it out because the game's not released yet, so Sony didn't want to announce anything about the content of the story, spoiler-wise, so everything's a bit blurred out. But this is an example of branching for just one of our scenes. So one of our scenes basically has more branching than, say, the entirety of Bandersnatch, for example. And it's interesting because branching isn't the only way to do an interactive story. In fact, we're exploring ideas where we don't even use branching. We just take people along a path. But in our case, we said, what is the point of branching? Is it just so the player feels like they have an input? Is it just so the player feels like they can, just because it's fun, So we had to really think about it, because most of these branching games, there's not much of a reason for it to be there, If anything, it will just dilute the story. So we started thinking about Erica's story in the same way that we think about news feeds on Facebook. If a news event happens in the world, we'll all see it on our Facebook feeds. But depending on, say, your political leaning or where you live, you might get, say, a left-leaning news publication, you might get a right-leaning news publication, or something in between. And so whilst we're all reading the same story, we're reading a very different interpretation of that story. So when it came to writing Erica, we started thinking about immersive theatre. There was a Punch Drunk show, a company called Punch Drunk, they do immersive theatre, called The Drowned Man, which changed my life. I saw that, basically quit my job and started Flavorworks. And the beautiful thing about that is that it invited you to come back time and time again. The story never changed, but you changed where you were and what you saw. And it's interesting how that changed the context of things, and how afterwards in the bar or next day at the office by the water cooler, you have these discussions about your experiences, and you realize whilst you've seen the same things, you've thought about them in very different ways. And so for us, the idea of giving the player this agency to change the course of the story was more about changing their perspective on it. So when it comes to those final moments, they're the ones deciding who is it they trust and what is it they believe. So ultimately, just to kind of wrap this up, we announced Erica at Paris Games Week a couple of years ago. It got some press around the globe. It seemed to be a pretty good reception. That excited us. And then we've basically gone underground for the last couple of years and tried to wrap this up, trying to work out how to do this, because there was no one to learn from. There was no other games out like this. And we had to kind of solve all these problems for us. So it was kind of like spinning 100 plates at once, and a couple of them fall and break, and you make some mistakes. But the ultimate result of it is that you feel like you've gotten the foundation for something new, and a foundation for something that doesn't feel like a gimmick or a toy, but actually feels like a meaningful video game for a core gaming audience, but also something that friends and family and people that don't play games can get involved with as well. And for us, that was a good confirmation of achieving our goals. And it's been really great to get Sony supporting us as well on that. So that's us at Flavorworks. Hopefully Erica will be out later this year. There's no release day announced. But feel free to contact me, check at flavorworks.co.uk, or buzz me on Twitter or whatnot. And if anyone's got any questions, then I'm happy to answer them. So thank you for your time. Yeah, I didn't know if there's mics or anything, right? Hi. Oh, no, there is a mic. There's a guy up there.
Here, down here.
Hello.
So when we make these video games, when we can choose, what's the most important thing to you personally? The experiences that come out of this decision, or the how it's called, the ending, the resolution of this decision? What's the most valuable thing for the public?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so the first thing that happens when the game starts is that it says, this is an interactive story, there are many paths, but no one path will hold all the answers. So we do have like alternative endings, and I remember when we first started announcing Erica, press would ask about how many endings they were. And for us, that wasn't important. At the time, we were really thinking one, maybe two. You know, like there's still a story to tell here, there's still something to say, and you don't want to sacrifice that by just having sort of random branching. Particularly as the more branching out you get, not only does it get more expensive, but the more diluted it becomes, the less the themes are explored and the less you have something to talk about. So for us, it was more about just that sense of the game listening to you as you're going through. In fact, when we started, choice was not ever like a goal. You know, choice was like, this is something that people understand exists in games, and if we're trying to sell this to somebody or we're trying to pitch it to a game studio, then branching is kind of like this established thing. Whereas for us, the idea of being able to touch the world in a tactile way, such as wiping a tear from somebody's cheek or brushing the hair behind the ear of a lover, for instance, those were the exciting things, for at least for me. And whilst people will get to the ending, and they might have different endings, we just find it's very interesting to have people discuss how they felt about a character. Were they evil? Were they a hero? And that's purely based on the perspective. So for me, it's about the journey rather than the destination, to put it in a cheesy way. Thank you. Hi.
Okay. How should we call this kind of stories? It's more like an interactive movie or film, or a video game without graphics?
Please let me know, because I've been struggling with that. I think of it as a video game. You know, I love video games. My career has been video games. For me, the only thing I was changing was aesthetic. You know, if I was doing this with computer-generated imagery, typical gameplay, I would do that. I might have some traversal in it just because, but it kind of, again, feels like it dilutes the concentration of the story because, you know, what is there to see? So I've always thought about it as more of a video game, and I think that's the important thing. We're using like the language of film as a shortcut to make sure that people who haven't played a game before can be like, oh, okay, I kind of get this. And it kind of has the resemblance of that structure. But for me, that's also kind of true for games right now, right? Most games are still stealing from that Hollywood three-act structure, for instance. But for me, it is a video game. And I love to kind of give it a genre that wasn't FMV, because for me, that kind of represents like a relic of the past, as, you know, as valid as that is. And you know, there's some great FMV games. But for me, yeah, it's other than the aesthetic, it should just be another video game on your shelf. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I really enjoy films and video games and everything in between. So my biggest passion is the narrative-driven games. So I've really loved the design that you've shown and the interactivity and everything. I think it's really, really nice, especially the focus pulling thing in the telephone scene. That looks awesome.
Oh, thank you.
But I wanted to ask, what's the narrative behind the game? Like, you have shown the technology, and could you give us like a brief overview of what the story will tell or something?
Yeah, sure. I just need to work. I need to remind myself what we've announced and what Sony will let me say. Ultimately, it's not it's not a story that like reinvents the wheel. You know, at one point, and the reason the game has taken a little bit longer than we anticipated is because after we announced the game, we went back to the drawing board. We kind of changed the story a little bit because we went so out there that we were like, okay, this is way too many new things at once. You know, especially when someone's taking a publisher's taking a risk on something completely unproven. So we've ended up with kind of like a traditional sort of thriller story. In this case, Erica has had this traumatic childhood experience happen to her. And this has kind of haunted her into adulthood. And then one incident happens that kind of brings that past to a head in the present. And she's finding herself being reunited with a lot of people who used to know her as a child. But essentially there's a serial killer that's trying to contact her. And so she's kind of the police are kind of trying to keep her essentially in like witness protection along with other people. but there's a lot of sort of subjective exploration of how reliable your perception is of what's going on. And so we kind of use a lot of that uncertainty to weave, to kind of get your head scratching a little bit. But there is a much easier, far way to explain it, but that I'm probably not allowed to say. So, but thank you for asking.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
So, very nice presentation, but I did have a question regarding the first question for branching, because aren't you afraid you get the same problem with Mass Effect, which was so wide, you could do all these things, and in the end, Shepard had 3 options, and all 3 for most people were bad. It's like, what you're doing is like a have your own adventure book, which is really fun. And like within a have your own adventure book, before you got to the end, you could actually die. You could make an option and have the wrong one. And there's a really interesting philosophical small comic about it.
Yeah.
You're onto the road and you find an old man. And the old man asks you a question. Do you believe that free will is true? If you believe him, go to page 140. If you disagree, go to page 140.
Yeah, no, interesting. I think so. Whilst I actually haven't played Mass Effect, I'm very aware of like the fallout with the ending. And the one thing I gather of that is that you're dealing with 3 games, 3 huge games of choices, right? And we're dealing with 90 minutes. And I think there's a big difference there. I think in terms of that personal investment of how you get to that ending and feel that it could be summarized in a few choices. In fact, for us, we're almost saying this 90 minutes is always about this single choice you come to. And it's just based on how do you feel about the world and the characters and what's going on. It's going to inform that choice, right? And so it's less about, okay, I've made all these choices for tens or hundreds of hours, and then I have to pick one of 3 buttons or colors or whatever, and it's more just about making your mind up about somebody, you know. And I think that works better than you'd expect. But I think we're also have kind of deliberately built a lack of resolve into the story, which is kind of a weird thing to do. It was a bit of a risk. But the idea there is that we're deliberately leaving things, especially because I guess the issue with branching narrative, in order to avoid turning to page 140 every time, is that you need to kind of leave some things unsolved so you can go back and look for things. Because that's the issue, is that writers want to explain everything they can to the player on every single playthrough. So then when you get to the ending, of course, there's going to be a lot of similarity. And so we're really much encouraging either going back and playing again to see what else there was, or not playing again, but then just talking to someone else about what they saw and piecing together the bigger picture. And no matter what kind of perspective you have, we kind of leave it all a little bit open-ended so we can leave those questions out in the open.
Yeah, so one last thing about it. I haven't watched Bandersnatch myself, but I heard the same kind of issue was you had all these options, but apparently also there was like, it ended in the same way. No matter what choices you made with Bandersnatch, actually was the same thing as well. So so people felt like a bit like, okay, so it didn't actually matter what I did. It still got me the same result, and that's what you said. It's more about the journey, not about the it's not about the end. Yeah. But for a lot of people, it's about the end. To make it's really interesting what you said, that speaking is an option. Like I love that in BioWare games, that if the option is mine, I decide when my character speaks. But then to have that sort of taken away feels like I don't have the choice. That you say throughout the whole game I have the choice, except for the end.
Yeah, that's kind of how we felt about it as well, is making sure that you are there. And one of the important things was, and we got a lot of, there was a lot of contention about this, was we wanted to leave Erica as much of a blank slate as we could, so you did feel like you were there. So actually Bandersnatch starts your character, or the character, because it doesn't really feel like he's you, is going for a job interview in a video game company. But you as a player, you weren't there when he decided he wanted to work in a games company. You weren't there when he got the interview, and you weren't there to decide whether he should take it or not. And I think there are quite a few endings to Bandersnatch, I believe, but if it wasn't the case that it was there, I think ultimately it doesn't just come down to the model and structure of branching, but it does come down to the art the art of writing a good story that deserves to be told as a branching narrative and isn't just told in a branching narrative because that's the tools you have. So we very much picked a story that we thought needed to be told as an interactive branching story, as opposed to let's shoehorn some choices in there.
Yeah, that's a lot better then.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks for time.
Thank you.
Hi, on your right.
Hi.
Can you talk a little bit about the shooting? Because I suppose it's not your typical movie shoot. Do you had a lot of back and forth between shooting and the development?
So it's kind of tricky, right? Because you can kind of iterate games into the last minute. Like you can cut someone's hair at the last minute. And with this, once you've shot the thing, it's in the can. You can't change it. And there's always this thing with film where they say you write the story 3 times, once in the draft of the script, once on the film set, and once in the edit. And so we did quite a lot of retroactive changing of the story in the edit, but there's only so much that you can stretch out of footage, particularly when you've designed it to be interactive. The way we went about the shooting was, the first important thing was like my background was filmmaking, so I wasn't a stranger to a film set. And whilst I was the creative director, I don't like that typically the writing and directing of games has always come down to the game designer fancying themselves as a auteur, wanting to write and direct, because that disrespects the craft of writing and directing. So I worked very closely with a live action director who was one of these examples of someone who loved video games as much as he did movies, and he was a professional in the film industry. So we were able to build a language together of how this would work and structures and rules. So we only use a close-up when it's an interaction. So after a while, when you see a close-up, you instinctively understand this is an opportunity to touch the world, as opposed to just using it in the traditional cinematic way. And so I would kind of instill a lot of these rules and restrictions, and our live-action director, Jamie, would be working around how he's going to block the scene, how he's going to get coverage within that set of rules. We only had like 44 days to shoot, and in that time we had to shoot about 3.5 films worth of content. So we were just very resourceful about it. And the more planning you can do up front, of course, the better. Because we had our touch video technology and we had our cookbook editor, we were able to essentially write the whole story down to start with, and then have people give people a copy of this text-based story, kind of like a twine, and they'd be able to play the entire experience as a twine, and when they gave it back to us, we knew exactly what choices they made. And so then we could rewrite, reconfigure, and the same came from when we'd actually finished shooting, and we gave it to people, and we could see what choices they made then, and we were like, okay, why are people making this choice more often? Is it the shot we're using? Is it the text on the screen? Whatever it might be, is it the time limit? And those are things we could manipulate as well. So, but I mean, yeah, there's honestly a book to be written about the sort of lessons we learn on making, shooting an interactive film, because we really did have to find a crew that was able to adapt. And the film industry has been around for 100 years, so they've got a very specific way of doing things. But every game you make is very different. In film, the way you get a film commissioned is to have a really good story and then attach a really good actor to it. In games, you go to an office and they say, what are 5 things that you're doing in your game that no one else has done in your game? Your USPs. So that's a very weird concept, and so it requires a very different approach.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So when Sony decided to fund your idea, what was their opinion about it? Did they know, for example, how they wanted to market it?
No, they didn't know anything. We just came in. We said, look, we're a new studio. We have this vision for how to bring more people to video games, as well as to maintain the ones that are there, but to get rid of a lot of the tropes and a lot of the things that we've become complacent about and taken for granted. To stop designing for other designers and start thinking about everybody. And then we showed them a 5-minute demo on our iPad, the one you saw before, where I was pinching open the origami, and mostly talked about a lot of what I talked about here, but a lot more succinct. And yeah, the vice president of PlayStation Europe just said that was the best pitch we've had in years, and then they flew us to San Francisco to meet Shuhei, and we demoed it to Shuhei, and then a couple of weeks later we heard back and they said, okay, we'll give it a shot. And I think one of the reasons for that maybe is because, games these days can cost $50 to $100 million, and we are nowhere near that, right? We're 8 people in a room with no windows. And so when it came to the shooting, however, right, like you're at a point in production where you're like, okay, we have a budget, we need to make a film to that budget. Whereas usually films, you start with a script and then they find a budget that actually matches the script, So it's a very backwards way of doing things because we'd have to rewrite to scale down to obviously make that reality. But I think, Sony just felt that there was a future in live action, and we trust them, and they trusted us. So we were very fortunate to get in that position. So thank you.
Hi, I'm here. No.
Hi.
Here. I'm Ángel Sucasas. I'm from El País newspaper. I have 2 questions. One of it is about the internal dissonance of having you as a character inside the game that can touch things, outside of Erica. And if you are thinking on that maybe in the future it's possible to give a narrative significance, a narrative meaning to that, aside then, in Beyond Good and Evil, that the point of view that is having the player could have a narrative meaning inside the story. Because if you are touching Eric and dropping away a drop of sweat there, who is that person that's doing that? It has a place in the story, it's only a player. That's one. And the other is something that is interesting to me in a personal level. Enoch. Is the book of Enoch, the real book of Enoch, the apocryph of the Bible? And if you can tell something about this.
So I like that you noticed the book, because when we did that was like an intentional thing that the story was going to expand upon. But when I mentioned that after we announced, we went back to the drawing board and tried to change the story and explored less out there things, the Book of Enoch thread we dropped that from the story. So in a perfect world, I would have updated that book to something more relevant to the news story, but unfortunately it won't be there anymore. But the reason we built the touch video tech was because every time you make a game, you're starting from scratch, it's new mechanics, it's new everything, and that takes years and years and years of R&D, and it's very expensive. And so rather than make, say, a design that works for one story, we wanted to build mechanics that could work for an infinite amount of stories, whether they were comedies or romances or horror or action. We even mocked up how we would do an action shooting game, with lots of destructible environments and poking out of cover and things, all 100% in camera. And so the idea of you as a player being a character, being someone who's affecting the world is, something we thought about as well. Are you a ghost? Are you haunting these characters? In this case, it was more about us just being the conscience of Erica. And it was amazing how many decisions went into trying to make us feel like we are connected to her rather than objectifying her. We'd rarely use a wide shot because we don't want to feel like you're too distant from her. And every moment, every scene is from her perspective. We never change perspective. So you're not omnipotent, just being able to see everything. For instance, what she doesn't see, you don't see, and she doesn't have any secrets from you. All these little decisions to try and make you feel connected to her. But even things like, say, wiping a bead of sweat, those are things that after a while we stopped doing that with Erica and we started doing that with other characters. So it felt like you weren't poking your own character in the eye or something like that, and that kind of seemed to resonate better for us. So. I think that's everyone. Great. Well, thanks so much for everyone for your time.